was another easy adventure for Spider-Man.
And we're done. I gotta hand it to ya. This is a pretty creative way for us to get back. And labor intensive. Hey guys, sorry I'm late. I had a little run with the police. What is this? This is me and Ultimate's way home. You built a super collider under my house? Built is a strong word. Strong word? What do you mean? Oh, I see.
What we do here is go back.
Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is my favorite film of 2023. Hello everyone, this is the Eliminator speaking, and I'm not even gonna try to build up to it. In a year that already felt jam-packed with spectacular movies, both live action and animated, Sony managed to kill two birds with one stone, as they managed to not only maintain interest in the Spider-Man brand, but also prove that the biggest technical leap in animation history wasn't a fluke. And today we're going to be seeing exactly why that is. So strap yourselves in as we do this one more time, yet again. Now, you're going to be surprised to hear this, but the first Spider-Verse movie actually wasn't all that successful financially.
You what?
I know, right? Despite making a pretty sizable amount on what is considered to be a very small budget, Into the Spider-Verse is actually the lowest grossing Spider-Man movie to date. Obviously, that's only the financial side of things, but when you consider how profits are usually what encourage a movie studio to make a sequel, Spider-Verse had a lot to prove when it came to making this film, as while the positive word of mouth definitely helped with this film's critical acclaim, even driving it to receive an Oscar, they couldn't ride off that success forever. So when it came time to make the sequel, the team really had to fire on all cylinders. Otherwise, this could easily be lights out for a franchise. Now, if my statement from earlier wasn't obvious, I think that this risk paid off. But it wasn't just me, as Across the Spider-Verse not only received equal to greater acclaim than the first movie, but it actually made almost twice the original movie's money during its time in theaters. And so, with that knowledge, let's take a look at all the different aspects of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse to see how they all come together to make what is, in my opinion, the best Spider-Man film since the first one. Now, just like the first movie, part of what makes Across the Spider-Verse really good are its characters. And seeing that this is a sequel, it means we'll be getting a plethora of new and old faces. Now, I normally save the spoiler warning for the story section of the video. I can't really talk about any of these characters or the things they do in this movie without going into spoilers. That's your warning. So, what we're going to do is, we're going to talk about the returning characters first, before bringing up the new ones and how they correlate to them. Starting with Miles Morales. As we saw at the end of the first movie, Miles has settled in pretty well to his role as Spider-Man, alongside other aspects of his life, with his introduction in this film basically being an extension of that. Though, this film is meant to take place a year and a half after the first, so it's pretty clear that Miles is past the honeymoon phase. Though I'd say the most drastic change coming into this film is definitely Miles' personality. In the first film, Miles was afraid of change and often dragged his feet to make choices, and as a result, he was constantly being pushed by the situations he was in and the characters within them in order to do things. His arc essentially being to take the first steps and then do the legwork to make sure that it paid off. And boy howdy does it. Right from his introduction in this movie, Miles is far more confident, assertive, and has a much clearer idea of what he wants out of life. But as I was saying, Miles basically is the opposite of what he was in the first movie, which actually factors into his arc in this story, where everyone is constantly telling Miles how they think he should do things, and Miles just has to keep going, knowing what he wants and doing what he thinks is right. He makes a new costume and continues to wear it despite everyone teasing him about it. He chooses to go to college in New Jersey despite his parents' reservations. He grows a mustache for a brief period of time before being dissuaded from it. But hey, he still tried it. He even jumps through a portal to another universe to find Gwen, even though he knows what the risks would be for doing so. I mean, yeah, Spot was using his holes to cause trouble and jump between universes, but let's be real. That was probably the last thing Miles had on his mind. In all seriousness though, most of the examples I've focused on specifically apply to Miles' personal life. So let's see how his superheroics are faring. When Miles jumps through the portal after Gwen and Spot, he lands in an alternate dimension where he catches up with the two, while also running into that universe's Spider-Man. Amidst the commotion, Spot narrowly escapes, but not before leaving a large amount of destruction in his wake that Miles and the other Spider-Men are forced to clean up. Amidst the chaos, the Spider-Man of that universe is put into a precarious situation where he has to save both his girlfriend and her father, the police inspector. Unfortunately though, he's not in really much of a position to do so, and just when all hope seems lost, Miles swoops in to save the inspector, despite Gwen advising against it. Now what I find interesting about this is everything we learn afterwards, as when Miles saved the police inspector, he disrupted a canon event, which is an event in every Spider-Person's life that is, for lack of a better term, character development. Worse still, we learn that Miles has yet to go through this canon event with his father, who is chief of police. And what I love about this is just how straightforward it is. There's no misunderstanding. Miles hears out the entire situation and we know that this is messed up for him. And what I love is that Miles choosing to save his father isn't treated as a selfish decision. We knew that Miles was going to save his dad the minute he saved the police inspector despite Gwen warning him. Admittedly though, his whole I can do both ideology is kind of flawed, but I'm willing to forgive that because Miles does want to still help people. His dad is just one of the major priorities. In fact, it even encourages some of the other characters to take a look at what they're doing within the Spider Society and reevaluate their whole idea, although not without a little help. Which brings us to Gwen. Now, since Miles and Peter were the main versions of Spider-Man that got focused in the first movie, it meant that Gwen and the others kinda got sidelined in favor of that dynamic. Which again, while not making the others bad characters, it definitely meant that they were underdeveloped, which this movie immediately fixes. Done with the spoilers, but this movie starts with Gwen, and serves not only as a recap of the first film, but also an expansion on her origin story, delving deeper into what actually happened and how it affects Gwen in the current day. For example, remember how Gwen briefly touched on the death of her version of Peter Parker? Well, due to the constraints of the first movie, they didn't really have a model for any other versions, so they just used one of Peter B. Parker's variants. But in this movie, they went out of their way to let us know that this guy was young. In fact, he looks younger than Gwen. Worse still, the movie goes out of its way to show us everything that encouraged him to become the Lizard, with him dying from debris from the fight with Gwen, and Gwen being blamed for his death.
But wait! There's more!
The police have now started a citywide manhunt for her, spearheaded by her father, of all people.
This is a pretty hardcore origin story.
Again, what I really like about this is that it builds upon a lot of the ideas that we saw in the first movie that seemed like they were just glossed over. For example, why is Gwen comfortable with talking to Miles and Peter when she mentions that she doesn't really do friends anymore? Well, think about it. Miles and Peter are other Spider-Men. Gwen probably wouldn't have given Miles the time of day if he wasn't. But since he's in a similar situation to her, she'd probably feel more comfortable sharing about her experiences as a superhero. My brother actually worded it really well, that Gwen needed a band that understood her. So it makes sense why she would join the Spider Society, especially considering the alternative. Furthermore, it explains why later in the movie, Gwen sides with Miguel and the other Spider-Men when Miles is arguing with them about the canon events. Yeah, she likes Miles, but with how her hands are tied, it's pretty difficult for her to side with him. Like, the only reason she's even in the Spider Society is because the curmudgeonly leader, Miguel O'Hara, gave her a watch at the last minute because someone else convinced him to. And then in the next scene we see with Gwen and this character, she clearly seems to be on thin ice with them, so that's how close she's cutting it. That's not even mentioning how her father tried to arrest her after she revealed her secret identity, despite her literally saving his life the moment prior. Like, the only reason Gwen got out of that situation is because of Miguel's intervention that I mentioned earlier. I mean, yeah, her dad comes around later, even going so far as to quit his job, but it clearly took time that they didn't have at that moment. And it's only after Gwen got kicked out of the Spider Society, on top of her having basically betrayed Miles. So, it really is just a double-edged sword. Luckily though, there is a silver lining to this situation, as Gwen plans to make things right with Miles after she gets a watch that allows her to travel to other universes, similar to the one Miguel uses, which she uses to rally together a team of Spider-Men to go look for Miles. And who do we have to thank but Hobie? Now, despite having about as much screen time as some of the more supporting characters, Hobie is pretty much the standout character in this film, and rightfully so. His carefree demeanor mixed with his more older brother type personality gives him great chemistry with Miles and Gwen, as well as giving him some of the best scenes in the movie. I like how the movie, and Miles' own perception of Hobie, set him up as this rival for Gwen's affection, when the reality of it is that he's just the only supportive figure in Gwen's life. So that's why she speaks so highly of him. I mean, yeah, there's Pavitra Prabhakar, but he's new on the job, and he seems like he'd just be friendly to anyone. Whereas with Hobie, it's clearly a choice for his character to be that way. Save for the universe we see at the end of the movie, Hobie comes from probably one of the worst realities a Spider-Man could live in, where all of his worst enemies are in positions of power and actively trying to oppress the people. And while most of the people are definitely on Hobie's side, it's pretty clear that he's the only one with the actual power to fight back. As such, Hobie probably had no one to really lean on, so it makes sense why he'd want to do that for Gwen, considering what she's going through. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just Gwen who he's supportive of, as Hobie is also pretty good with Miles. For example, when Miles saves the police inspector, Hobie openly embraces him, as actively trying to hype him up. When Miles shows interest in the Spider Society, Hobie tries to dissuade him from it, but eventually he decides to let Miles figure things out for himself. And when he does, he gives him the tools he needs to escape. And then when Gwen gets thrown back into her universe, Hobie then proceeds to make a watch, like I mentioned earlier, which Gwen is obviously going to use to save Miles. So Hobie's just a supportive character all around. He's a lot like Sonic the Hedgehog, where he's basically just freedom incarnate, and simply wants others to be able to live their lives the way they choose, unlike Miguel. Now, if you remember the first movie, you'll probably know that Miguel actually had a post-credit scene there, in which he mastered dimensional travel by creating a watch that allowed him to travel to other universes, before using it to travel to the first Spider-Man cartoon. Though a lot has changed since then. As I mentioned previously, Miguel is the leader of the Spider Society, which is a group of all the multiverse's elite Spider-Men and women, who all work to preserve the canon, which, as I mentioned earlier, is all of the most pivotal moments in a Spider-Person's life. In terms of personality, Miguel is probably the most serious that you could ever get for Spider-Man. Like, if you were to put Batman and Spider-Man together, this is what you'd have. And it makes sense, considering the fact that he's tasked himself with this massive operation. With all the various moving parts, you can't really afford to make any mistakes, which actually factors into Miguel's backstory. See, from what we can tell, at some point after forming the Spider Society, Miguel found a universe where there was a version of himself that was a father, implying that the child he had in his universe had died. After the alternate version of Miguel pulled an Uncle Ben, our Miguel stepped in his place, and soon after, the universe crumbled to pieces. Believing that his actions took out an entire universe, Miguel now blames himself and is adamant that the canon must be maintained in any universe, no matter the cost or the toll that it takes on any Spider-Man. And I mean, honestly, that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately though, the way he goes about it is completely wrong. I already brought up how Miles learns that his dad is going to die, which happens to the chief of police in every Spider-Man universe. But what's worse is that Miguel then tries to contain Miles, due to him being an anomaly, since the spider that bit Miles actually came from an alternate universe in the first movie, meaning that there's a universe without a Spider-Man. In fact, we actually see this universe at the end of the movie. Also, during the section on Gwen, I brought up how her father eventually came around to her identity as Spider-Woman, and wound up quitting his job, which potentially saved his life. Which both justifies and nullifies Miguel's points, because if there is a universe without a Spider-Man that is still standing, then that means that disrupting the canon isn't what destroyed the universe. Though Miles and Miguel's conflict doesn't just stop at a simple disagreement, as when Miles tries to escape back to his universe, Miguel goes rabid trying to chase after him, highlighting just how much of a force he is to be reckoned with, and also how far he's willing to go just to project his own insecurities. But focusing on the former point, I just like to point out just how imposing Miguel actually is compared to everyone else in the movie. People talk about how the Spot becomes a genuinely terrifying force, but look at Miguel next to it. As I mentioned earlier, if you were to combine Batman and Spider-Man, you basically get Miguel, and that goes beyond just his personality, but also his appearance. Like, Miguel's supposed to be the hero, but honestly, if you were to put him and standard Spider-Man side by side, he looks more like an antagonist Spider-Man would fight, an anti-Spider-Man. Like, the only one who looks more intimidating than him is this concept art for Man Spider. and even then, that's presented in a sillier context. Couple that with just how much more aggressive Miguel's powers are. Where most Spider-Men stick to walls, Miguel has claws and fangs. Never mind the fact that anyone who isn't Spider-Man immediately perceives him as a threat. Kinda makes you wonder why someone like him would be put in charge of this massive organization of spider people. And it even makes him look like more of a villain than the actual villain of the story. Which brings me to Spot. Now, among Spider-Verse's breakout characters, Spot basically completes the trifecta. Hobie's given the coolest scenes, Miguel's scenes are the most intense, and Spot's are generally the funniest. Unfortunately though, most of this humor is done at his expense, as Spot isn't really taken seriously by anyone. It actually makes sense, given that his entire origin is based on a blink and you'll miss it joke from the first movie. See, remember the spider that came from an alternate dimension and wound up biting Miles Morales? Yeah, that was a result of Spot and Dr. Octopus's experiments with the Super Collider. And eventually, when Miles managed to destroy it, it released a massive amount of energy that affected Spot. Like most superheroes, the accident wound up changing his appearance. Though unlike most superheroes, Spot was basically laughed out of his job and anything else he had in his life, forcing him to turn to a life of crime, which even then he's not very good at. And as if to make matters worse, when he encounters Spider-Man basically laughs at him in his face, which leads to him trying to prove himself as a more serious antagonist throughout the movie. Something I really like about this progression is how Spot is always competent. He knows exactly what he needs to do and how he needs to do it, but the problem is just that he doesn't know how to apply himself towards anything. CinemaWins, I think, actually pointed this out. But one way you can tell that Spot is becoming more proficient with his powers is how his holes are placed across his body. At the start of the movie, he's just covered in random spots sticking out of everywhere. When we see him later on in Mumbattan, he has all of his spots converged into a single part of his torso, save for the one on his face. And then, finally, after absorbing an entire Super Collider, he's almost completely pitch black with little white patches, highlighting just how powerful he is, as he's basically just a living void now. Now, this is where my gripes with Spot's character begin. I like the screen time that he's given, and I like all of his scenes, but it kind of feels like they didn't really want him as the main antagonist. Now, I mean no disrespect when I say this. Spot, again, as I mentioned, I liked Spot's presence in the movie, but it feels like they really wanted to tell a story about Miles and Miguel's conflict with each other, because Spot gets taken out of the movie about halfway in. And while yes, he's going to be paid off as a major force in the third movie, it's already after all this buildup we've gotten in this film. I don't know, I just feel like Spot was kind of sidelined in this movie. But with that, we can finally move on to the supporting characters, starting off with Jessica Drew. I mean, she's established as being a bit more loose compared to Miguel, though still having this sort of no-nonsense attitude, as we saw with her interactions with Gwen. Unfortunately, she isn't really given much to do within this movie. Hopefully, they'll give her more to do in the third movie, but we get there when we get there, which is probably a few years from now. Anyways, returning from the first movie are Miles' parents, and I'd like to say, while they are given a bit more to do here, I still feel they suffer from the same kind of issue that they did in the first movie. Since the first movie is focused primarily on the multiverse, with Miles just so happening to be the POV character, it means that Miles' personal life is kind of pushed to the wayside. Their thing in this movie is that their relationship with Miles is becoming a bit strained ever since he really accepted his role as Spider-Man, which has been starting to affect his schoolwork. And while this seems fun on paper, again, we never really got much build up to Miles' life prior to Spider-Man, so we don't really know what's changed. I mean, aside from his schoolwork, but it was never really established earlier that Miles was more or less responsible before the first movie, especially with how little of a role Miles' mom played in the whole thing. Though I like what they do here, with her being scared of Miles' growth and change over the course of the story, wanting to make sure he doesn't lose sight of who he is in pursuit of everything he wants in life. I mean, his dad, he's basically the same as he was in the first movie, so not much to say there. Same goes with Pavitra Prabhakar. I like the gag about him being a version of Spider-Man whose life is actually a lot easier, with Spider-Man not really even being an inconvenience to him. But beyond that, there isn't too much to talk about. He serves his purpose in the story. The same cannot be said, however, for Peter B. Parker, who makes his return in this film. One thing I love about this version of Peter Parker is that they allowed him to really grow and change, and also show us the effects of Spider-Man, or a life as Spider-Man, in a way that the other versions couldn't. And they continue that trend here, as now he has a child. child. I remember there being this controversy among fans with him and Jessica Drew, since she was pregnant and Peter had a child. And I'd just like to say that these are the children of superhumans, more specifically Spider-Men. So I feel like shaken baby syndrome wouldn't be too much of a problem for each of them. But I'm getting off topic. Anyways, I like that Peter B. Parker is kind of put to the side, since his arc was basically completed in the first movie. I like that he has more of a smaller arc, where he, alongside Gwen, side with Miguel at first. But over time, they kind of learn to stand up for their friends, regardless of whether or not it clashes with the groups they're associated with. Sometimes it is better to do your own thing. And with that, we finally finished the characters section. Now, let's move on to the story. Like the characters, the story of Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is very fun and interesting in its own unique way. But before we begin, I'd like to give one last spoiler warning. I mean, if you've made it this far in the video, odds are you've either seen the movie or you just don't care. So with that settled, let's begin. In Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, Gwen is struggling with the isolation she feels after returning to her own universe at the end of the first movie, and she feels there's no one who understands her. One day, after stopping a supervillain from another universe, Gwen learns that Kingpin's Super Collider actually displaced a bunch of villains across the multiverse, and that there's an elite group of spider people called the Spider Society, working in order to repair that damage. Seeing this as a chance to see Miles again, Gwen takes up the offer to join. Meanwhile, Miles is struggling with a similar issue, though his life generally seems to be going better than Gwen's. However, all that changes one day when Miles interrupts a robbery at the local corner store and comes face to face with the Spot, one of the scientists who worked on the Super Collider, who has now been transformed. After accidentally insulting him, Spot becomes determined to prove himself as a genuine threat, and now Miles, alongside Gwen and a few other Spider-Men, must work to catch him, and making sure that Spot doesn't do any more damage to the Marvel multiverse. If you remember the characters section, you'll remember me saying about Miles that his personality in this movie is basically the opposite of what he was in the first film. And I think that bears repeating, but on a much larger scale. Across the Spider-Verse is one of the most ambitious animated movies I've seen. It's one of the most ambitious sequels I've seen, and that is by being the opposite of what the first movie was. Allow me to give an example. The first movie starts off with a throwaway character, that being the Prime Spider-Man, then transitions over to Miles, the lead, after which we're introduced to the catalyst of the movie. This film, however, starts with one of the co-leads of the film, that being Gwen, and then, as we go through her life, we're introduced to the catalyst of the film, that being Miguel and the Watches. Whereas the villain in the first film needed a device that would allow him to look through the multiverse and see into other dimensions, the villain in this movie can do it on command with his own powers. The secondary antagonist was a lackey for the villain and had a root in the hero's personal life, whereas the secondary antagonist in this movie is their own person, as the leader of an organization, while also being a member of the hero's superhero life. The first movie has the protagonist figuring out who they are and discovering their place in the world. The second movie has them trying to stand by it. The first movie tells a generally self-contained story. Meanwhile, the second movie requires a sequel and is very much part one of a two-part story. The other Spider-Man in the first movie felt more like set dressing to showcase the wackiness of the film's premise, whereas here they play a much more active role in the story. And last but not least, as I mentioned in my section on Miguel, the secondary antagonist in the first movie was kind of a quiet force that worked alongside the main villain of the film, only to be taken out later, whereas in this movie, the main villain disappears about halfway into the story, while the secondary antagonist takes the main focus. See, this is what I love about the Spider-Verse movies. They knew they had to be more than just animated superhero movies, so they took concepts and storylines that were only really possible through animation, or things that the live-action movies couldn't get to yet. Like, we have a movie where Miles Morales, Gwen Stacy, Miguel O'Hara, and Hobie Brown all play major roles in the story. Meanwhile, the MCU introduced its third Peter Parker less than 2 years after the last one, and Spider-Verse even managed to do that better than them. It just goes to show how much effort went into these movies. Like, I never thought in a million years that Spider-Verse would be the gold standard for animated films now and to come. But that's the reality that we're living in. So, with all that said, let's wrap up the video. Alright, the collider's fired up. Me and Ultimate should be able to get back to our dimensions now. That's great. Is there any chance I'll see you guys in the future? With any luck, we'll be able to master this whole portal thing at some point down the line. But for now, this is goodbye. Yeah, see ya. You know, those guys weren't half bad, but it's nice to have the house to myself again. Mr. Eliminator? What? Officers, what are you doing here? Yeah, the neighbors wouldn't stop bothering us, so we went back to the station to receive a warrant to search the premise. Yeah, what is that? $1,000 is all you need to forget you saw any of this. You know, with the day we've had, that seems like a pretty fair deal. Thank you guys for watching. Be sure to like, share, subscribe, and tell me down in the comments section, which Spider-Verse movie do you like more, the first or the second one, and why? Also, as a bonus question, tell me, what do you think is going to happen in the third movie? And what would you like to happen? As always, subscribe today to join the A-list, and have a great day. Bye!